On June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history unfolded on the beaches of Normandy. Operation Overlord, known as D-Day, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, opening a vital second front in Western Europe. The bravery and sacrifice of Allied forces that day reshaped the course of World War II and, arguably, the entire 20th century. Yet, what if history had taken a different turn? What if the impossible had happened, and D-Day had failed? This isn't just a hypothetical exercise, it's a chilling exploration into the fragility of victory, and the immense stakes of that pivotal day. The success of D-Day was never assured. It hung by a thread, influenced by countless variables: weather, intelligence, German preparedness, and the sheer luck of battle. For months leading up to June 6, Allied commanders wrestled with overwhelming challenges. The English Channel, with its treacherous currents and unpredictable weather, was a formidable obstacle. German defenses, though not uniformly strong, represented a deadly gauntlet. The very act of landing hundreds of thousands of men and their equipment onto hostile shores was an unprecedented logistical nightmare. Every plan, every contingency, was built on the assumption that a foothold could be gained. But what if the tides had been wrong? What if the storms had raged harder? What if Hitler's panzer divisions had reacted more swiftly, or the Luftwaffe had not been crippled? These questions lead us down a dark path, into a world profoundly different from the one we know. Today, we delve into an alternate reality, meticulously reconstructing the probable consequences of such a catastrophic failure. We will explore how the Allied defeat at Normandy could have reshaped the Western Front, pushed Britain to the brink, left the Soviet Union to face the full wrath of the Wehrmacht, and profoundly altered the very nature of World War II. This is not just a story of military defeat, it's a narrative of political upheaval, of civilian suffering, and of a world where the shadows of tyranny might have stretched far longer. Join us as we imagine the unthinkable, a world where D-Day failed. On that fateful morning of June 6, 1944, the meticulously planned invasion of Normandy faced an array of potential pitfalls, any one of which could have spelled disaster. The Allied advantage was a delicate balance of deception, overwhelming force, and sheer courage against deeply entrenched German defenses. One of the most critical elements was the weather. The actual invasion was launched during a brief, narrow window of clear skies and calmer seas. A more severe storm, or a misjudgment of the forecast, could have crippled the landing craft, making the beaches impassable and rendering air support impossible. The paratroopers and glider infantry of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, vital for securing flanks and disrupting German communications, were heavily impacted even in real history. Many were scattered far from their drop zones. A more severe dispersal, perhaps due to stronger winds or more effective German anti-air, could have rendered their efforts negligible, or worse, led to their wholesale destruction behind enemy lines. Imagine a young American paratrooper, Private Miller, landing not in a field, but in a flooded marsh, his equipment waterlogged, his rifle lost. He would struggle for survival, isolated from his unit, facing an unknown enemy. This wasn't a rare occurrence, but a widespread catastrophe in this alternate timeline. German resistance, though initially slow to react, possessed formidable firepower. The Atlantic Wall, while incomplete, had significant strong points. If key German commanders like Erwin Rommel had been present and able to deploy their panzer divisions more swiftly to the threatened sectors, the beachheads could have been annihilated. The formidable German 352nd Infantry Division, positioned at Omaha Beach, inflicted horrific casualties on the real D-Day. If their defenses had been just slightly more robust, their artillery more accurate, or their machine gun nests even more concealed, Omaha could have become an unmitigated slaughter, forcing a full retreat. The story of Sergeant Schmidt, a veteran German machine gunner at Point du Hoc, exemplifies this. In our history, he was eventually overcome. But imagine him with more ammunition, or an extra squad to cover his flanks. His position could have held for hours longer, pouring a relentless storm of fire onto the approaching landing craft. Air superiority was another non-negotiable condition for Allied success. In real history, the Luftwaffe was largely absent. But what if new German jet fighter prototypes, like the Me-262, had been operational in greater numbers and deployed effectively against the invasion fleet and ground troops? The Allied intelligence effort, Operation Fortitude, successfully convinced the Germans that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. What if German intelligence had seen through this deception, or if a critical double agent had been exposed? German reserves, particularly the 15th Army, might have been positioned at Normandy. Under such circumstances, the thin Allied lines, already struggling to establish a foothold, would have been immediately overwhelmed. The beachheads would collapse under concerted German counterattacks, pushing the remaining troops back into the sea. This wouldn't be a tactical retreat, it would be a rout. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, famously carried a note accepting full responsibility for failure. Speculative, in this alternate reality, that note would have been released, a stark testament to the gravest military setback in Allied history. The emotional and strategic impact would be devastating. This catastrophic failure wouldn't just mean a temporary delay, it would fundamentally alter the strategic landscape of the war, setting the stage for a prolonged and far more brutal conflict. With the beaches of Normandy becoming a graveyard of Allied hopes and material, the immediate fallout would be swift and brutal. The remnants of the invasion force, if any survived the initial onslaught, would be forced into a humiliating retreat across the English Channel, leaving behind vast quantities of equipment and countless dead. The psychological blow to the Allied high command and the morale of the troops would be immeasurable. The narrative of inevitable victory, carefully cultivated by propaganda, would shatter. Doubts would creep in, undermining confidence in leadership and strategy. For Germany, a successful defense of the Atlantic Wall would be a propaganda coup of unprecedented scale. Hitler, previously plagued by paranoia and strategic blunders, would see his belief in the unbreakable fortress Europe vindicated. German morale, flagging after years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front and Allied bombing, would surge dramatically. Inside the Führerbunker, the news of the Allied rout at Normandy sparks wild celebrations. General Jodl, usually stoic, allows himself a rare, genuine smile, as Hitler slaps him on the back. The belief in a final victory, once a desperate hope, now seems a tangible possibility. Politically, the ramifications would be catastrophic for the Western Allies. Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt would face immense pressure, both from their own populations and from within their governments. Calls for resignation, for a reassessment of the entire war effort, would become deafening. The dream of a swift end to the war in Europe, dependent on opening a second front, would evaporate. German forces previously held in reserve in France could now be redeployed. Some might be sent to bolster defenses against potential future Allied attempts, but a significant portion would undoubtedly be sent east to confront the Soviet Union. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, which had ramped up significantly to support D-Day, would continue, but without the immediate prospect of ground invasion, its effectiveness would be questioned. Resources would be strained, and public confidence in the war effort would wane. In London, Mrs. Jenkins huddles in a tube station air raid shelter, the faint rumble of distant German planes overhead. The news of the Normandy disaster has spread like wildfire, replacing hopeful anticipation with a chilling dread. Her neighbor whispers, "Will this war ever end?" The logistical and material losses from a failed D-Day would be immense. Destroyed landing craft, lost tanks, and casualties numbering in the tens of thousands would represent a setback that would take months, if not years, to recover from. Another cross-channel invasion would become a distant, almost impossible prospect. The strategic balance of power would shift dramatically. Germany would be free to concentrate its full attention on the Eastern Front, potentially stabilizing its lines or even launching new offensives against the Red Army, which would now bear the entire burden of the European war. The psychological impact on occupied Europe would also be profound. Hopes of liberation, kindled by the promise of D-Day, would be brutally extinguished. Resistance movements, already operating under extreme danger, would face even harsher crackdowns and lose vital external support. The failure of D-Day would not merely be a military defeat, it would be a fundamental recalibration of the war, paving the way for a more formidable, confident Nazi Germany, and a world plunged into an even longer, darker conflict. This shift would have devastating consequences for Britain, now truly isolated. With the hopes of a Western front crushed, Britain would find itself once again on the front line, facing the full, undiverted wrath of the Third Reich. The brief respite from the Blitz, enjoyed in the lead-up to D-Day, would end with brutal finality. German V-weapon attacks, particularly the V-1 flying bombs and the V-2 rockets, would intensify dramatically. Without the pressure of an active Western front, Germany would be able to dedicate more resources and launch sites to these terror weapons. London, and other major British cities, would endure a sustained bombardment far exceeding anything experienced in the early war years. Civilian casualties would soar. Sarah, a young mother in East London, clutches her 2 children tightly in their damp, crowded Anderson shelter. The distant thrum of V1s fills the night, each silence followed by the terrifying explosion. The news of Normandy's failure has drained all hope from her eyes. How much more can we take? She wonders. The Royal Air Force, already stretched thin, would be forced into a relentless defensive battle against a resurgent Luftwaffe, now potentially bolstered by aircraft freed from the defunct Western Front. The Battle of Britain, a victory from 4 years prior, would be revisited with renewed ferocity. The economic strain on Britain would become unbearable. With the Lend-Lease program potentially curtailed or reconsidered by a disillusioned United States, and without a clear path to victory, essential supplies of food, fuel, and raw materials would dwindle. Rationing would become even more severe, pushing the population to the brink of starvation. The psychological impact of prolonged siege and lack of progress would erode morale. The initial resolve and defiance of the British people, so evident during the Rio Blitz, would be tested to breaking point under the seemingly endless rain of German bombs and missiles, coupled with the crushing news from the continent. Air Chief Marshal Dowding, now an elder statesman, paces his study, listening to the incessant drone of enemy aircraft. His mind replays the Battle of Britain, but this time, the odds feel insurmountable. They never stop, he murmurs, looking at a framed photo of a young RAF pilot. Inside Churchill's war cabinet, divisions would emerge. The Peace Party, advocating for a negotiated settlement with Germany, would gain significant traction. Faced with the destruction of their cities, the decimation of their fighting forces, and the grim prospect of fighting on alone, the argument for peace would become compelling, even if abhorrent. A negotiated peace, if it were to occur, would likely involve devastating concessions. Germany might demand the return of its pre-war colonies, recognition of its conquests in Eastern Europe, and a free hand against the Soviet Union. Britain would emerge from the war fundamentally weakened, its empire irrevocably diminished, and its moral standing compromised. The strategic implications for the rest of the world would be profound. Without a British base for future invasions, the liberation of Europe by the Western Allies would be stalled indefinitely, allowing Germany to consolidate its hold over the continent. Britain, once the defiant bulwark against Nazism, would be transformed into a beleaguered island, desperately clinging to survival, while a truly isolated Soviet Union faced the full, terrifying might of the Wehrmacht. With D-Day's failure, the Eastern Front would become the singular, brutal crucible of the European war. The German Wehrmacht, freed from the strategic imperative of defending a Western Front, would be able to redeploy vast numbers of divisions, tanks, and aircraft to reinforce its lines against the Soviet Union. This influx of German strength would reverse the slow but steady Soviet advances of 1943–44. Major offensives, like Operation Bagration, which devastated German army groups center in real history, would either be scaled back, or meet with catastrophic failure against reinforced German lines. Sasha, a young Soviet soldier, shivers in his foxhole near Kursk, the constant roar of German heavy artillery a terrifying lullaby. News of no second front has reached the lines, draining the last vestiges of optimism. He clutches a worn photograph of his family, knowing the war just got infinitely longer and bloodier. Stalin's demands for a second front had been persistent and increasingly desperate in our timeline. In this alternate reality, his pleas would fall on deaf ears, as the Western Allies struggled to recover from their own disaster and defend Britain. This would lead to a profound and bitter sense of betrayal within the Soviet leadership. The Red Army, despite its immense sacrifices and growing strength, would face a war of attrition against a German war machine that was no longer fighting on two major fronts. The material advantage, which had begun to shift in the East, would once again favor Germany, at least temporarily. With the strategic initiative firmly back in German hands, major cities like Leningrad and Moscow, which had endured years of siege and threat, would once again come under direct and severe pressure. German offensives could even push further into Soviet territory, aiming to cripple its industrial heartland. In a Moscow war factory, Anya, an elderly worker, collapses from exhaustion, her hands still calloused from handling metal. The foreman gently helps her up, but his own eyes are filled with worry. They just received news of another German push, demanding even more production. For motherland, he urges. The human cost would be astronomical. Millions more Soviet soldiers and civilians would perish in the prolonged, unceasing struggle. The Soviet Union, already bled dry, would face an existential threat that could push its totalitarian regime to even greater extremes to mobilize every last resource and person. Under such immense pressure, and with no prospect of Western relief, a desperate Stalin might even consider a separate peace with Germany, a grim echo of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. While historically unlikely given the ideological hatred, the sheer weight of survival could force such an unthinkable consideration. The failure of D-Day would relegate the Soviet Union to a lonely, agonizing battle for survival against a German empire whose grip on Europe would remain unbroken. This would inevitably prolong the war and intensify the hidden race for the ultimate weapon, the atomic bomb. A D-Day failure would guarantee a significantly prolonged global conflict, pushing the war's conclusion well into 1946 or even 1947. The conventional military stalemate in Europe, with Britain under siege and the Soviet Union fighting a desperate, isolated battle, would accelerate the most terrifying scientific race in human history, the quest for the atomic bomb. For the United States, the Manhattan Project would receive an even greater sense of urgency and an unimaginable infusion of resources. With the prospect of a conventional victory in Europe now distant, the atomic bomb would become the sole viable option to force an end to the brutal conflict and prevent further catastrophic loss of life. Dr. Oppenheimer, gaunt and perpetually stressed, pores over calculations late into the night at Los Alamos. The news of the Normandy disaster has reached their secluded outposts, deepening the shadows under his eyes. He pushes his team harder, knowing the fate of the free world now rests squarely on their shoulders. Simultaneously, Germany's own nuclear program, the Uranverein, would receive a monumental boost. Hitler, emboldened by his Western victory, would prioritize the development of a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon, capable of breaking the stalemate against the Soviets and terrorizing Britain into submission. German acquisition of heavy water from Norway, crucial for their fission research, would be more aggressively pursued, and Allied efforts to sabotage it might fail. Key German physicists, who in our timeline subtly resisted the Nazi regime, might face greater coercion, or even genuine conviction, to deliver the ultimate weapon. The race would not just be about developing the bomb, but also delivering it. Both sides would accelerate ballistic missile programs. The V-2 rocket, already a devastating terror weapon, would be seen as the potential delivery vehicle for an atomic warhead, escalating the stakes to unimaginable levels. A prolonged war into 1946 to 1947 would mean an increase in strategic bombing campaigns by both sides, targeting each other's industrial and research facilities. Allied bombers would relentlessly strike at German nuclear sites, while new German long-range aircraft might attempt retaliatory strikes against the U.S. East Coast. Major Klaus Richter, a Luftwaffe pilot, meticulously plans a mission over the Atlantic. His new aircraft, the America Bomber, is designed to reach New York. The thought of carrying a payload far deadlier than conventional bombs fills him with a mixture of fear and grim determination. For the Reich, he whispers to himself, the prospect of nuclear escalation would transform diplomacy. Neutral nations would scramble for safety. The very nature of warfare would change overnight with the first deployment of an atomic weapon. The world would hold its breath, teetering on the edge of utter annihilation. A prolonged war driven by the nuclear race would reshape global alliances and rivalries, potentially leading to a Cold War that begins not with ideological conflict, but with a terrifying nuclear standoff between a victorious Nazi Germany and the United States, irrevocably altering the post-war world. In this chilling alternate future, a victorious Germany, having repelled the Western Allies and subdued the Soviet Union through a prolonged, brutal war, would consolidate its grip on a vast European empire. The dream of Großgermanisches Reich, the Greater Germanic Reich, would be a horrifying reality. The political and social landscape of Europe would be irrevocably altered. Democratic institutions would be eradicated, replaced by totalitarian regimes loyal to Berlin. Cultural expression would be suppressed, education would be indoctrinated, and dissent would be met with brutal efficiency. In Berlin, 1950, a young boy named Hans watches a propaganda parade with his parents. He sees the gleaming tanks and disciplined soldiers, but his father's hand squeezes his own, a silent warning. Hans knows that behind the spectacle lies a world of fear and unspoken truths. Britain, isolated and battered, might exist as a German satellite state or a perpetually besieged island nation, its independence a fragile illusion. The United States, having avoided direct engagement in a prolonged European land war after its initial D-Day failure, would confront a new, formidable global superpower. Technological advancement, particularly in rocketry, aviation, and potentially nuclear energy, would accelerate under the Nazi regime, driven by military imperatives and unburdened by ethical constraints. This could lead to a frightening vision of advanced weaponry and surveillance technology. The moral cost would be immeasurable. The Holocaust, in this timeline, would likely have been carried out with even less international scrutiny or interference, resulting in an even greater loss of life. Millions more across Europe would suffer under a regime of unparalleled brutality and racial purity. Dr. Anya Sharma, a brilliant scientist in occupied France, works under duress in a German research facility. Her discoveries are twisted to serve the regime's dark purposes. She hides her true feelings behind a mask of compliance, dreaming of a world that never came. The United States would adopt a doctrine of aggressive isolationism, focusing on its own hemisphere, while maintaining a vast, powerful military to deter Nazi expansion into the Americas. A new Cold War, not between ideologies of communism and capitalism, but between democratic and fascist superpowers, would define the global order. The United Nations, in its historical form, would never come into being. Instead, international relations would be dominated by spheres of influence, military alliances, and a constant threat of conflict between the remaining free nations and the Nazi-led European bloc. This alternate history paints a chilling picture, a world where the triumph of fascism reshaped continents, where hope was extinguished for millions, and where the moral compass of humanity was irrevocably bent. It underscores the profound weight of that single day in June 1944. Our journey into an alternate past, one where D-Day failed, reveals a stark and sobering truth. The success of Operation Overlord was not merely a military victory, it was a hinge point in history, a moment where the future of freedom hung precariously in the balance. Had it faltered, the world we know today would be unrecognizable. We've seen a Western front that collapsed, a Britain under renewed siege, and a Soviet Union left to face the Nazi war machine alone. We've witnessed the acceleration of a terrifying nuclear race and the chilling prospect of a Europe under permanent Nazi dominion, casting a long shadow over the entire globe. This counterfactual exercise highlights the immense courage and sacrifice of those who fought on June 6, 1944. Their success, against formidable odds, was not predetermined. It was forged in the crucible of battle, by extraordinary bravery, meticulous planning, and an element of fortune. The Allied forces who stormed those beaches carry not just weapons, but the hopes of a world yearning for liberation. Their victory ensured that the ideals of democracy and freedom, though still imperfect, would endure and eventually flourish, rather than being crushed under the iron heel of tyranny. The echoes of D-Day resonate still. It serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of peace, the cost of freedom, and the profound impact that moments of collective human endeavor can have on the destiny of nations. May we never forget the debt we owe to those who ensured that D-Day would not fail.